Hi everyone, welcome to my week 15 video part 1, and this is on fiction 1945 to the present, and it's the very last unit that we're going to be flying through. Sadly, we just don't have enough time to devote much to it, but if you'll follow along with me, go to course documents, and then obviously you get there by going to content and then look for fiction 1945 to the present. So let me first provide you with a brief overview. The fiction that came out of World War II, so 1939-ish to 1945, sort of lacked the desire to shock that had energized previous war novels. And writers seemed able to regard armed conflict with sort of a sense of, more of a sense of philosophical detachment, if you will. But after the dropping of that first atomic bomb at the end of World War II, America and the world entered into a new era during which the possibility of mass destruction was weighing heavily on everyone's minds. And so the idea of individuality, and we saw that with modernism, but now this idea of its negative consequences as well as its transcendent powers becomes a unifying principle of American lit following World War II. Because all of a sudden now, it's possible for one person to destroy the entire world if one person becomes a leader of a nation that is that has access to nuclear weapons. And so similarly, we had protest movements that began in the 1960s, and that led to a remarkable diversification of perspectives and expressions in American later on in the 20th century. But among the forces for social change, probably the greatest one was, of course, the civil rights movement of the 60s, the student movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the beginnings of the gay rights movement, and the environmental movement. And each of those, to varying degrees, really changed our culture. Now, at East Ridge High School, one day we decided that we were going to have a sit-in, and this was sort of a common thing that young people around the country were doing. But of course, normally they were doing it and they had a cause, like civil rights or environmental concerns or whatever. Well, we didn't have a cause because we were in East Ridge, and we were just doing well to even know half of what was actually going on in the rest of the country. So we just decided that all of us at a certain time, we were going to drop our books and we were going to go outside and just sit down and just not go to class. And that was going to be our sit-in. And that's what we did. And we had absolutely no cause whatsoever. Oh boy, that's East Ridge for you. So anyway, luckily others had great causes. But a few voices outside of the mainstream, by virtue of just their style or their ideas, had always played some role in American lit. After the 1960s, it became increasingly harder and harder to define what the mainstream was. So that time period from the end of World War II, 1945, up until roughly, say, the late 60s, early 70s, saw the publication of some of the most popular works in our literary history, like To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which is one of my favorites. And the last few of the more realistic modernist writers, along with the wildly romantic beatniks, largely dominated that time period, while the direct respondents to America's involvement in World War II also contributed in a notable way to the writings there. So now I want to talk for a moment about the 1950s, the Beat generation. So after World War II, a group of American writers referred to as the Beat generation communicated their profound dissatisfaction with society through their unconventional writings and lifestyles. So remember how we saw that same thing right after World War I with the Lost generation, when we had that group of expats who moved to Paris and were feeling very disillusioned. Well, sort of the same thing was happening after World War II with the beatniks, but they had a very unconventional sort of lifestyle. They mainly were headquartered in San Francisco. And so think hippies, now in East Ridge, we tried to be hippies too. We'd put flowers in our hair and, wear bell-bottom pants and things like that. We tried to be cool, but we really had no clue what was going on. So notable writers within the group included people like Kerouac and Burroughs, Ginsberg, of course, and their writing was characterized by this sort of improv quality, very raw, improvisational, and again, they're trying to liberate writing from its formal concerns and from plot, and often drawing on personal experience. And the best known, I would argue, beat novel is Kerouac's On the Road, which is semi-autobiographical, and it celebrates direct sensory experience and freedom from everyday responsibilities. So that was sort of at the core of the beatnik and the hippie movement, is just, just forget work and just forget any kind of responsibility or commitment, and it's just all about being free, which sounds really good but doesn't work out well in the end usually. That brings us to postmodernism, and this is definitely going to come back and haunt you on the final exam. So its exact parameters, date-wise, remain debatable, but from the early 1970s to right now, the most salient, in other words, the most significant literary movement has been postmodernism. And so if I ask you, on the final exam, what is the most salient literary movement from the 70s to now? You're going to say it's postmodernism. And so Pynchon, who was a sort of a practitioner of the form, drew in his work on modernist figures, or fixtures, I should say, techniques, like temporal distortion, so the distortion of time. And you'll see that in a lot of postmodernist work. So in one chapter, you might be in the present time, and then in the next chapter, suddenly you might switch and be 100 years in the future or 50 years in the past. So that was a technique very common to postmodernism. Unreliable narrators, so narrators who may not necessarily be telling you, the reader, the truth. And so you have to think, are they deliberately distorting the truth? Do they maybe not know what the truth is for some reason? Internal monologues, so we hear, characters' thoughts. And so Pynchon would take those techniques and sort of couple them with distinctly postmodern techniques like metafiction. So metafiction is a technique where we draw attention to the fact that this is in fact fiction. And interestingly, Booker T. Washington did it in his Up From Slavery, when he was writing about his experience as a little boy being a slave, when he had to sleep out in the cold without any shoes. And he experienced severe frostbite in one of his feet. And he's writing many, many years later, and he says, "The gash in my foot was so deep that I could lay the pencil I'm now writing with into that gash." So he's kind of, what he was writing was not fiction. It was historical fact. But he's drawing your attention to this idea that I'm writing now all these years later and looking back at this incident. And so that's kind of like what happens with metafiction when postmodern writers draw the reader's attention to the fact that this is indeed fiction. And then unrealistic names, weird characterization. Here I mentioned Benny Profane, but in Good Country People, Flannery O'Connor uses names like Manly Pointer and Mrs. Hopewell and all of that. Plot elements that are kind of absurd, hyperbolic humor, so over-the-top humor, deliberate use of anachronisms, and remember we saw that in some of the writing that we've looked at, Journey of the Magi, and archaisms, a strong focus on post-colonial themes and sort of this subversive commingling of high and low culture. And in 1973, Pynchon published Gravity's Rainbow. That was a leading work in the genre. We won't be looking at his work, sadly, because we don't have time, but that sort of gives you an idea of some of the techniques of postmodernism. Toni Morrison would be my most favorite postmodernist writer, and one of my most favorite writers ever. And she's the most, at the time of this writing, recent American recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature. She had a very distinctive lyrical prose style. So it was prose, but it felt like poetry. It was so lyrical and rich. And her debut novel, The Bluest Eye, came out with critical acclaim in 1970. It was coming on the heels, of course, of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And so it's widely studied still in American schools, and it explores the conventions of beauty established by a racist society. So this idea that if you're really beautiful, then you have those blue eyes, right? And it's painting a portrait of a black family in search of beauty in whiteness. And so, of course, they can't find that within themselves. And thus that double consciousness that Du Bois would often talk about. And since that time, Morrison experimented with lyric fantasy in her two best-known later works, Song of Solomon and Beloved, my very favorite piece ever. If you get a chance, see the film. It stars Oprah Winfrey, and really the film version of Beloved was Oprah Winfrey's brainchild. And she plays Setha, and really Beloved is a ghost story. So if you get a chance to watch the movie and read the book, it's fabulous. So Harold Bloom drew comparisons between Morrison and Virginia Woolf, and Beloved was chosen in a 2006 survey conducted by the New York Times as being the most important work of fiction in the last 25 years. So if you get a chance, have a look at it, and you'll see a lot of those postmodern techniques like metafiction and temporal distortion and things like that, anachronisms in Beloved. So listen to my part 2 video, which I'll have on a separate announcement, which will be the final exam review, and I'll see you then.